Talia Jenkins had never been one to let the demands of her career wear her down. As a corporate lawyer, she thrived in high-pressure situations, navigating complex legal battles with the precision of a seasoned professional. She had worked tirelessly to reach her current position, constantly proving herself in a world where women, particularly Black women, were often overlooked. She had earned her place at the top, and no one could deny her expertise. Yet on a routine flight home after a long day of negotiations, Talia was about to face an injustice that would challenge her resolve. After weeks of high-stakes meetings, Talia was eager for a quiet flight in first class. She had carefully planned this moment of reprieve, reserving her first-class seat in advance. She needed the space to relax, to unwind after a taxing week, and she had no reason to believe that anything would go wrong. However, as she approached the gate to board, the situation took an unexpected turn. The gate agent, a young woman with a clipboard in hand, informed her that her seat had been overbooked. Talia's initial shock quickly turned to frustration as the agent explained that she would have to move to economy class. Overbooked? Talia repeated, disbelief flooding her voice. She had paid for a first-class ticket, and now she was being told that she would be moved to a less comfortable seat without any explanation. "That's not acceptable," she added, her voice firm. The gate agent seemed unfazed, offering no solution or apology, instead repeating that there was nothing she could do. "I'm sorry, but it's just company policy," she said, her tone distant. Talia's heart sank, and she felt a pang of anger rising in her chest. This wasn't just about a seat, it was about being treated as less than, as if her presence didn't matter. With a deep breath, Talia followed the gate agent through the terminal, trying to keep her composure. As they walked toward the back of the plane, the sting of the situation hit her harder. She had worked for years to be treated with respect and dignity in her professional life, yet here she was, facing an act of discrimination that made her feel invisible. The passengers who were seated in first class now seemed to be oblivious to the injustice unfolding just a few rows away. She could see them relaxing in their cushioned seats while she was being shoved into the cramped and uncomfortable economy section. The contrast was glaring, but the sense of unfairness cut deeper. Talia sat down in the economy seat, the discomfort of the situation settling heavily in her chest. She could feel the heat of her anger rising, but she knew she had to keep her composure. There was nothing she could do in this moment except sit and reflect on what had just happened. The air in the cabin felt stifling, and she glanced back toward the first-class section. There she saw the empty seat that had been reserved for her, now occupied by someone else. Her grip tightened on the armrest as she realized that this was no mistake. It was a deliberate choice, a small but impactful act of discrimination. The injustice she felt was about more than just the seating arrangement. It was about the way her worth had been diminished, about the fact that, despite everything she had accomplished, she was still being treated as if she didn't belong. This wasn't the first time she had faced racism in subtle ways, but it was the first time it had hit her so directly, so visibly. She had been bumped from her rightful place for no reason other than the color of her skin, and that reality was impossible to ignore. The reality of systemic racism had been laid bare before her in this moment, and it was a reminder that even in the most professional of spaces, prejudice could still rear its ugly head. Talia's mind raced as she sat there in the cramped economy seat, staring straight ahead. She had endured years of such treatment, silently pushing through each instance of bias and inequality, convincing herself that things would eventually change. But this moment felt different. It wasn't just about the inconvenience of being moved to a lower class. It was about the larger, more insidious message that this experience sent, that her value was less than that of others, and that she could be pushed aside without a second thought. As the plane began to taxi down the runway, Talia pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened Twitter. She typed out the tweet with determination, each word carrying the weight of her frustration. "Discriminated against today by airline name. I was removed from first class with no explanation. It's time we demand better." When she hit send, she wasn't just sharing her experience. She was starting a conversation, one that could no longer be ignored. The moment Talia posted her tweet, her phone buzzed with notifications. At first, it was just a few comments, friends and followers offering their support. But as the minutes passed, the floodgates opened. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from all corners of the internet. Other Black women sharing their own stories of discrimination, some recounting their own experiences on flights, others detailing their struggles in everyday life. Each message resonated deeply with Talia, affirming that her experience was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger issue. Hashtags began to surface, such as number Black women deserve better and number first class equality, and within hours the tweet had gone viral. The movement was no longer just about Talia. It was about every person who had faced similar treatment. It was about the millions who had been overlooked, dismissed, and disregarded because of their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. The simple tweet became a call to action, a spark that ignited a firestorm of support and outrage. Talia watched in awe as her message spread across social media platforms. News outlets began picking up the story, and soon she was being interviewed by journalists who were eager to hear her side of the story. She spoke with passion, explaining how this experience had been a wake-up call for her, a reminder that racism was still alive and well in many industries. She also spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how small or large the act might seem. In those early days of the campaign, Talia felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't expected. For years, she had silently endured acts of discrimination, internalizing the notion that her worth was always in question. But now she realized that she had the power to change the conversation. Her words had weight, and they were resonating with people all over the world. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for all those who had been silenced. The response was not without its challenges, however. Some took to social media to discredit Talia's claims, accusing her of exaggerating or playing the race card. Others, especially in the airline industry, attempted to downplay the situation, claiming it was just a mistake. But these attempts to minimize her experience only fueled her determination. Talia knew this fight wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew that it was necessary. She couldn't let her voice be drowned out by those who were too comfortable in their privilege to see the truth. As the campaign grew, Talia's inbox flooded with invitations to appear on national television shows and news programs. The interviews were overwhelming at first, but with each appearance, her message became clearer. She wasn't just calling out one airline for its discrimination. She was calling for a broader reckoning with the systems that allowed racism to persist unchecked. Her advocacy began to take on a life of its own, and soon she was speaking at rallies, conferences, and panel discussions pushing for reform and change. But the fight wasn't just about public appearances and media attention. Talia worked tirelessly behind the scenes to organize petition drives and lobbying efforts, pushing lawmakers to hold companies accountable for their discriminatory practices. She knew that real change would only come through legislative reform, and she was determined to ensure that the voices of marginalized communities were heard. Through it all, Talia remained grounded in her mission, to create a world where Black women and all people of color would no longer have to fight for the respect and recognition they deserved. The battle had only just begun, but Talia knew that the tide was beginning to turn. As Talia's campaign gained traction, the backlash began to grow. The airline, under pressure from both the public and the media, issued a statement acknowledging the incident, but labeling it as an unfortunate mistake. They offered Talia a voucher for a free flight as compensation, a gesture that felt utterly hollow to her. The airline's response was an attempt to dismiss the gravity of the situation, and Talia saw through it. She rejected the voucher, stating publicly that what she needed wasn't compensation, it was accountability. She called for the airline to implement stronger anti-discrimination policies and sensitivity training for its employees. But the public outcry wasn't limited to the airline. As Talia's profile rose, so did the number of critics. Some of her colleagues, especially those in corporate circles, began to distance themselves from her, fearing that her activism would hurt their reputation or business interests. They were uncomfortable with the attention her campaign was attracting and urged her to back down. Talia's refusal to be silenced came at a personal cost. Her professional relationships began to fracture as companies that had once supported her now viewed her as a liability. She was invited to speak at high-profile events, but behind the scenes, some sponsors began to drop out, citing concerns about the backlash they might face. For the first time in her career, Talia faced the reality of what it meant to challenge the status quo. It meant making sacrifices. Her inbox was flooded with messages of both support and hate. While the support from grassroots organizations, fellow activists, and the general public was overwhelming, the hate messages were harsh and personal. Racist remarks, threatening letters, and even online trolls began to target her, calling her everything from an attention seeker to a radical. But Talia refused to let the negativity sway her. She knew what she was fighting for was much bigger than herself. It was about a future where people like her could live without fear of discrimination. Despite the challenges, Talia found solace in the community that had formed around her cause. Other Black women, many of whom had faced similar forms of discrimination in their own lives, reached out to offer their support. They shared their stories with Talia, reinforcing her belief that her fight was not just for herself, but for all the women who had been silenced and overlooked for far too long. Talia's determination only grew stronger as the backlash continued. She doubled down on her commitment to change, using her platform to educate others about the systemic issues of racism in the airline industry and beyond. She took her fight to corporate boardrooms, pushing for companies to adopt real, meaningful diversity and inclusion policies. And she did not back down when faced with opposition, because she knew that the cost of silence was far too great. As the backlash continued, Talia realized that the only way to truly hold the airline accountable was through the legal system. She had spent years in the courtroom, but this would be different. It wasn't just about a business dispute. It was about challenging a deeply ingrained system of inequality. Talia reached out to a civil rights attorney she had worked with in the past, asking for help in filing a lawsuit against the airline for racial discrimination. The decision was not one she made lightly, but Talia knew that if she didn't take action, the injustice she had suffered would be swept under the rug. The legal process was lengthy and complex, and Talia quickly found herself in the middle of a battle that was far bigger than her personal experience. The airline hired high-powered lawyers to defend its actions, arguing that the seating mistake had been an administrative error and that there was no evidence of racial bias. Talia's legal team, however, was determined to prove that the overbooking was not just an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern of racial discrimination. They dug into the airline's history, uncovering previous instances of Black passengers being mistreated or forced to give up their first-class seats. Talia spent countless hours reviewing legal documents, meeting with her legal team, and preparing for what would be a long and arduous battle. She was no stranger to hard work, but this was different. This was personal. Every deposition, every hearing, felt like a direct challenge to her humanity. She was fighting not just for her own dignity, but for the dignity of every person who had ever been treated unfairly in a public space because of their race. But as the weeks wore on, she began to feel the weight of the fight bearing down on her. The legal process wasn't just draining, it was isolating. Talia had always been the type to handle stress in silence, to power through without showing weakness. But now she found herself struggling to keep her emotions in check. The stress of balancing her career with the pressure of the lawsuit, coupled with the ongoing public scrutiny, took its toll. She began to feel the exhaustion creeping in, and it was becoming harder to maintain her composure. In one particularly challenging moment, Talia found herself in the courtroom, facing the airline's lead attorney, a well-known litigator who had built his career defending corporations against lawsuits. He was dismissive and condescending, constantly undermining her credibility. "You don't seem to understand, Ms. Jenkins," he said during one cross-examination. "This is just business. People get moved around. It's a mistake. It happens." His words stung, and for a moment, Talia felt a rush of anger welling up inside her. But she quickly composed herself, knowing that this was not about her emotions, it was about justice. Talia's strength in the face of such blatant disregard for her experience was inspiring, but it also revealed the stark contrast between her resolve and the attitudes of those who tried to diminish her. While she knew she could never change the minds of everyone, she was determined to make the airline and its lawyers realize that their behavior was not acceptable. This lawsuit was more than just a legal matter. It was about sending a message to every corporation, every individual, that they could no longer ignore the systemic racism that pervaded their institutions. As the trial dragged on, more witnesses came forward, many of them Black passengers who had experienced similar treatment. Talia's case gained momentum, but it was clear that the fight would be long and hard. Yet through it all, Talia refused to back down. She knew that the outcome of the case could set a precedent, not just for airlines, but for all businesses. If she could win this battle, she could force change across industries. After months of intense legal proceedings, the day of the verdict finally arrived. Talia sat in the courtroom, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick with anticipation, and for the first time since the case had begun, she allowed herself to think about the possibility of a victory. Her legal team had done everything they could, presenting a compelling case that the airline's actions were not just a mistake, but a reflection of deeply ingrained racial bias. The testimonies of other black passengers who had been subjected to similar treatment were powerful, and the evidence painted a clear picture of systemic discrimination. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had been overseeing the case, called the courtroom to order. Talia's stomach churned as the judge began to read the verdict. It was a tense few moments, but when the judge finally spoke, her words were a resounding affirmation of Talia's fight. "The evidence is clear," she said. "The airline's actions were discriminatory, and their treatment of Miss Jenkins was unacceptable. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff." Talia felt a wave of emotion crash over her. The relief, the joy, the vindication. It was all too much. She had won. This victory was not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been treated unjustly, for every black woman who had been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed. The airline was ordered to pay a substantial settlement, and they were also required to implement comprehensive changes to their policies, including mandatory anti-racism training for all employees. It was a hard-fought victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. The news of the ruling spread quickly, and Talia was celebrated as a hero. The media covered the story extensively, with commentators praising her resilience and determination. She was invited to appear on talk shows and in interviews where she spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice. "This isn't just about one airline," Talia said during one interview. "This is about creating a world where people of color, especially black women, are treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." However, Talia knew that this victory was just the beginning. The battle against systemic racism was far from over, and there was still much work to be done. She continued to use her platform to advocate for change, pushing for broader reform in industries across the board. But for the first time in a long while, Talia allowed herself to feel proud of what she had accomplished. She had taken on a powerful corporation and won, and in doing so, she had created a legacy of change. In the weeks following her victory, Talia found herself at the forefront of a national movement for racial justice. Her case had become a symbol of the power of individual action in the fight against systemic inequality. Other black women who had faced similar discrimination reached out to Talia, sharing their stories and seeking her guidance. She became a leader in the movement, not just for racial justice in the airline industry, but for racial justice in every sector. Her legal victory was a catalyst for change, inspiring other individuals and organizations to take action against discrimination. Companies began to reevaluate their policies, and many were forced to implement stricter anti-discrimination practices. Talia's case also sparked a larger conversation about the need for diversity, equity, and inclusion in all industries, from healthcare to law enforcement. The impact of her fight went far beyond the courtroom. It reshaped the way businesses and institutions approach racial bias. Talia's work wasn't just about holding corporations accountable. It was about creating a cultural shift. She began working with nonprofit organizations, launching initiatives aimed at educating people on the realities of systemic racism. Her speeches became a rallying cry for those who had been overlooked, and her voice became a beacon of hope for those who had been silenced for far too long. But Talia's success came with its own challenges. As she rose to national prominence, she faced even more intense scrutiny. Critics who had once called her too vocal or too radical now labeled her as a sellout, accusing her of compromising her values in exchange for fame and fortune. But Talia stood firm. She knew that the fight for racial justice was never going to be easy, and she was prepared to face the harsh realities of her newfound platform. Despite the negativity, Talia remained focused on her mission. She continued to work with legislators to advocate for policies that would address racial disparities in the workplace. She helped to establish a legal fund for other individuals who had been discriminated against, ensuring that more people had access to legal resources and support. Her work was far from over, but she was confident that the foundation she had laid would inspire future generations of activists to keep pushing for justice. Talia Jenkins had started as just one woman, standing up for her rights in a moment of injustice, but in the end, her fight had sparked a movement that changed the course of history. Her story became a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of speaking out, and the undeniable strength of a single voice in the fight for equality.